Це громадське міжнародне, щонедільна передача, але не з нашого київського студії, з київської студії, але з Риги. Ми висвітлюємо Ризьку конференцію. Це найбільша подія, в якій йдеться про безпеку в цьому районі. Це не тільки просто звичайна передача. Це велика подія для нас, через те, що ми будемо тут проводити ще дискусії, не тільки інформати. Тому ми медіапартнери. Це досить унікально для цього району. Ми стараємося вести розмови, коло розмов поширити.
There is a lot, so you'll add what we will talk in this program today.
The Riga conference, as you said, one of the biggest events in the region when it comes to especially security. And what people are trying to figure out is actually very important. How do we redefine security issues? How we redefine European security and pan-regional security after the Russian-Ukrainian war that has profound impact, negative impact on just, people in Europe feeling secure about their borders or about their economies anymore. And those issues are heavily covered here. We have a number of head of states and governments from not only Baltic states but Central, Eastern Europe. The Ukrainian Prime Minister was here who was trying to sell again the idea of a unifying front against the Russian aggression. But also the importance of economy, where a lot of Central and Eastern European countries struggling with ongoing recessions or economy issues, and there is not a single golden rule how to get out of it. But because it's all similar, people are trying to talk and actually figure out how to do that best.
So today you'll see some of our best interviews. We would have some heads of states, Minister for Foreign Affairs, and as well the expert on the region who deals with not just the economy, but some things like the organized crime, like Galeotti, or we would talk to the expert on Ukraine, like Orysia Lutsevych from Chatham House, who will discuss and with us what to do with de-oligarchization in Ukraine, and there is lots more. There are some couple of great interviews you've done, Max.
So we have a lot of high-profile interviews for you when it comes to head of states. For example, we talked to the Estonian president on security issues. We talked to the foreign minister of Latvia when it comes to not only geopolitics but also civil rights battles in the region. And we talked to a lot of analysts and academics and people who actually know stuff about how to fix the region and all of those numerous problems. So there is a lot ahead. Stay with us, and we'll continue coverage of the event with hashtags RigaConf and Hromadske Riga. So follow us online. We have a lot of digital experiments going on at the moment. You can use our Snapchat, Periscope, Twitter, Facebook, you name it.
This is a lot I do not know, but we have to figure out all to have all the ways to distribute the information you definitely want to know.
So stay tuned, and we will write back.
President Ilves, there are already a lot of talks for a couple of years about, the threat from the Kremlin, what should be the answers. So the problems are already there. We've discussed this many times. At this time, can we make any assessment? Is anything had been learned by NATO, by the West, and is any way to move forward besides discussing the problems? Well,
I think NATO does have a slow learning curve, but I think that the assessment of the threats has changed substantially. It is slowly changed, yes, but it's not only the Anschluss of Crimea and the troops in the Donbass. It's also in this region, all kinds of funny flights and transponderless flights. It's Putin and it's the Russians going into Syria. So all of these together have made people think more about the world, at least come to the conclusion that this is something other than what was once the post-Cold War era.
And what have Estonia learned from, defending itself from the information war, for instance?
Well, we actually have studied done an in-depth study with this, actually one from CNN too, and found out that the difference between people living in Estonia who are primarily Russian-speaking and the ones who are primarily Estonian-speaking is that the ones who are primarily Russian-speaking don't believe any media, none, zero. I mean, they just have no, which in the case of the Russian media, it's largely a useful approach to take, but unfortunately, regarding sort of serious journalism from the West, that's also discounted. I mean, I think that we need not worry as much about disinformation as I did, because we're finding more and more that people aren't paying attention to it.
We've talked shortly about this information war, which probably was a lot that was spoken about it. But in this regard, what are the limits of the freedom of speech, and are there any in this environment?
Which one, ours or yours?
Ours and yours as well.
Well, I mean, this is a constant topic of debate, and it varies from country to country, culture to culture, but certainly I do not believe that hate speech, anything that incites violence, should be left unresponded to. I'm not a big fan of criminalizing things, but certainly you can, in fact, use the civil courts to make people understand they will pay for inciting violence.
We are very concerned now, how to counter populism. What would be the politicians' answers on populism these days in Europe and in countries like Ukraine?
Well, I think it's a new problem for us in the European Union. We have had small populist parties always, but now we see a surge in populism fueled by the refugee crisis that we face in Europe, and so we have. We'll probably have 1 million this year, and yesterday the European Commissioner Moscovici, I think, said that we expect 3 million more refugees in the next 3 years. So this has led to, I think, every country in the European Union has had a big surge in populism. Some countries in government and some countries in opposition to the government. And this is, of course, a worrying development. We talk about both left populism and right populism. Many of these parties seem to be partially funded by Russia, and so it's certainly undermining democratic will in some countries. We see that some of the populists do tend to be very pro-Russian. We see that, if you look at the UKIP, Nigel Farage thinks Putin is wonderful. In Front National in France, Miss Marine Le Pen is a big fan of Putin. So.
But this is in the Western Europe, but there are also the things here in the Baltics, in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine as well. And it's very hard for the technocrats really to fight that. So what could be the answer?
Well, liberal democracy has to deal with these things in a liberal democratic way, and so you have to engage and talk to the people and convince them that's sort of populist, simplistic populist, xenophobic attitudes are not the solution.
And also, if you speak about this region, the Baltics, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, if we can unite that, we see that in the people generally agree that there are values, there are freedoms, but when it comes to something, to voting, to any kind of procedure, if it's a rights of the minorities or anything else, the society is not often really supporting that, and it's the card.
Well, in my country, so far, we've been fairly lucky in that I would say the Estonian population is fairly committed still to universal democratic values. I can't talk about other countries, but so far, we're okay.
And how would you describe your relations with Moscow these days? Bearing in mind that there was, for instance, this exchange of the Estonian officer. It has happened place.
Well, we should be grateful that someone they kidnapped is given back. No, I think that has nothing to do with our relations. Well, I mean, we don't see any change. Certainly, I mean, I've heard some diplomats say, oh, this is a sign for the good. They returned your police officer. I go, what do you mean, sign for the good? They kidnapped him from our territory. I mean, we're so good about, why is this? What does that represent? That we? So I don't really see any change. And I think that, you know, we're fairly low on the pecking order of importance. So we're not a priority.
Do you think with the Russian moves, with the Kremlin moves in Syria, you know, this region is kind of for some time is not in the focus of the Kremlin, and you know can have a bit of a risk?
Oh, I'm sure I think they can pay attention to more than one thing at a time. I mean, if we do, then I think they can. So I mean, the headlines are focused on Syria right now, but that doesn't really mean that Ukraine is not a constant concern of my government and of the countries of NATO. We have additional concerns, but no one thinks that anything is solved in Ukraine, as you saw this morning in the conference. Everyone knows, everyone follows.
Because of this support is existing towards Ukraine, but there could be some expectation also from your government, from the European governments. We understand reforms, you know, making things better, but what exactly? What would be also the measurement that things are moving forward for you?
Well, I mean, we as a sort of a country, I think all the three Baltic countries have extensive experience with reform, dramatic reform, know that it doesn't, I mean, it takes a while for them to take effect. So the real thing you need to do is do them, and then you won't see tomorrow that suddenly the corruption will decrease because you did something today. But if you do it today, that means you will see over the months and the years that, in fact, the society will be changing. So what would I say? Liberalizing the energy market, just because it's a drain on your, it's a massive drain on your economy. Really stepping up the quality of police work in an anti-corruption effort, because that is, whether it is true or not, the reputation is something that must be fixed. So that is where I think the problem lies. And I think if you, and then, I mean, there's still a fair bit of cronyism, and that's always a problem. There's cronyism in every single country I've seen. I mean, the greatest, they still have cronyism, but sometimes it's more obvious in some places than others.
Do you think the unity in the European Union regarding Ukraine, regarding the still keeping the sanction against Russia, is still there, and what could be the obstacles?
Well, it seems that it will be there for a while. As long as Mrs. Merkel is leading the issue, the sanctions will remain. No worry about Estonia's view on this.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much again for joining us here in Riga. And I'm going to start with the whole purpose of the event that we're attending, the Riga conference. It's mostly security and foreign policy event, but this year it's mostly about security and collective security in the year after the Russian-Ukrainian war. And the basic concern of people in here that we lack a kind of understanding, and we lack the feeling of security after what happened to Ukraine, to Eastern Ukraine, to Crimea. What do you think, should we try to fix already the system of collective security that basically malfunctioned when it comes to the Ukrainian crisis, or find out some kind of new creative way how to reestablish communal security for the whole region?
Well, I think that what we have seen, and you were referring to 2014, the events as they started with the illegal annexation of Crimea, then the war in the eastern Ukraine, is actually already the second event that proves that the system as it has been designed post-World War II, approved 40 years ago in Helsinki through the final act, has malfunctioned. The first thing I always cite as an example is Georgian-Russian war. And actually the inability of international organizations, of international community in particular, to stop the aggression, to stop the war, has been actually a good incentive to continue in Ukraine. So we also don't know what else could happen in, let's say, coming years and where it could happen. So from that point of view, we definitely see that the system doesn't work. I think that what we have to do, still to do our best to restore that international liberal order in Europe that we wanted to build. Neither Ukraine nor Latvia at that time were independent countries. The Soviet occupation of the Baltic states, as well as Ukraine being part of Soviet Union, did not allow us to be part of the concept of Europe whole and free. But I still think that we should concentrate on the rebuilding of that post-war, post-Cold War liberal international order, where we respect territorial integrity, where we respect international law, but also where we get some kind of instruments also of enforcement. Of course, we use economic sanctions. There is some political instruments. We all understand that those countries who are not covered by NATO Article 5 are even in greater danger than those countries that are within the NATO. So from that point of view, I still think that the whole effort should be put in restoring or modifying that order, but I really don't think that we would be able to work out something new under the current circumstances with more assertive, more aggressive Russian Federation on one hand, but also there are also some other challengers of the...
It's true, but the issue of Crimea is very important here because it's so illustrative. For many countries, and especially regular people back in the States or in Europe, Crimea still is viewed largely as a local issue. It has nothing to do with their lives. They're not very interested in dealing with it. They see it as a part of a sphere of influence of Russia or Russian territory. But at the same time, Crimea is such a good illustrative example of I think the biggest assault on a system of international law since it was built in mid-20th century. But because it's very hard to sell this idea to many people abroad, that it matters. In that case, if there is a tribalism in geopolitics, for example, or there is no international law, it will hit you back at home in so many ways. But still, we're struggling to deliver this message. And Ukraine is very active at this. Baltic states are very loud, despite the size of countries. They're very loud pushing this message back then. But why do you think it's not working out very well, and the whole global community is still not convinced that this is not an international crisis, but rather a local conflict?
Well, I would disagree. If we see the result of voting last year in the United Nations General Assembly, it was very convincing vote of 100 members of the United Nations on the illegal annexation of Crimea and condemnation of that act. We all see that in March, on the anniversary of so-called referendum. We've got also the right statements from the European Union, from many EU, actually all EU member states. We have seen also that this has been reaffirmed wherever there are visits by presidents, prime ministers, ministers of many countries. When it comes to general public, let's face it, I think that we are living in a situation where trouble in the eastern neighborhood of the European Union, in the southern neighborhood of European Union, the whole Syria crisis, migration, development of economy, that you get so many news, so many challenges that unfortunately when you see changing pictures, changing headlines all the time, we tend to focus now on what's happening in Syria, what happened with the Russian planes that apparently has been attacked by ISIS group. So we see so much change of news in this 21st century environment that people really sometimes do not think about one or another issue for a long time. If asked, they certainly think that the breach of international law in the 21st century is not something acceptable. At the same time, yes, indeed, we have to look at this also from the point of view of governments, that they should probably provide more active, let's say, policy when it comes to giving the right messages not only to Ukrainian people but back to, let's say, our own societies. Look, for instance, in this country, in Latvia, since the beginning of refugee crisis, we are talking only about refugees. We are talking about Syria, which is the first time when there is some keen interest. I recently visited high school in the province of Latvia, and children, they were already the high school people. They were asking a lot of questions about Syria, about migration, and about Ukraine. So it's not somewhere, in a kind of disappearing mentality. But at the same time, unfortunately, if we see that there are so many challenges and both governments and people's attention sometimes are shifting, I believe, and that is something that we are doing both here in Latvia as well as when we are talking with our colleagues from the European Union, then we remind that while there are so many developments, let's not forget also about the events of 2014, illegal annexation, that Minsk agreements are not implemented, and Ukraine is on the radar screen.
My last question, not the least important though, is about civil rights battles in Eastern Europe. It's a part of geopolitics. It's a very important issue that each country struggles in the region very much. For LGBT community, especially in Eastern Europe, you're kind of inspiration or hero in the way that you're one of those rare examples of public people being out and supporting the cause. But in many countries, we're moving with different speeds when it comes to civil rights equality. There is lack of understanding. There is, for example, spike of violence and situation got worse in Ukraine last year. There are positive examples like the historic gay pride in Riga this year or in Warsaw. But at the same time, there is a lack of understanding in those societies all around the front line, thanks to Russia partially, why it's important to have a civil rights equality. It's not just about gay people, but equality as per se. How do you think it's possible to sell the message in the right way And considering the progress that even Latvia went through in the recent couple of years, what could be the universal formula for the region when it comes to pushing for equality?
Well, that's the most difficult question I have got in weeks. It's always great to talk about what our response should be to that or another international crisis, but this one is very difficult. Look, the Latvian history and example has been also quite, let's say, symbolic. You were referring to Europride in June 2015. That was a peaceful demonstration. Yes, still probably too much police around for security reasons, but I think that our Ministry of Interior and Police Force did their best to ensure that there are no any provocations, and they did very professional work. But if you compare the first Pride in 2005 with violence on the street, a lot reminding, for instance, what happened in that or another capital recently, in Tbilisi in 2013. Well, I know also that in Kyiv there has been quite developments in the past. So we also had the same. The most negative attitude, the very aggressive crowd, not big one, but still trying to somehow ruin the whole concept of pride, the whole concept of civil rights. We are still not able to work out, let's say, the necessary legislation. This parliament doesn't have majority on this, but what I have seen that over 10 years, the attitude is changing. It's changing slowly. But in order to change it, I think that there is a need to start with some small steps. First step is the authorities must ensure, first of all, must ensure the right of people to go out on the streets to let's say, have their events like prides or demonstrations. And those demonstrations have to be protected. We failed miserably 10 years ago. 2 prides were quite an event, I would say. There were also attempts by local government to actually prohibit the demonstrations, the pride, and then actually the legal system stepped in. The courts made crucial decisions saying that it's freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and those decisions were overturned. And the police was instructed to provide necessary security. I attended myself another pride in 2012, which was the local one, again under the very heavy police presence, but already no demonstrators against 1 or 2 crazy people shouting something. This was already a change. So that's the responsibility, first of all, of the authorities to ensure that such events may take place. People, when they see other people, they start to think that probably, it's nothing terrible.
Human beings.
Human beings. Second, yes, there also is an importance of how the news media and journalists are, let's say, showing the events, the coverage. And again, if the coverage is more or less, let's say, unbiased, again, that helps. And then, of course, I think that from time to time, and I was not the first one to come out, we have some journalists, some people, if I see that there are some more or less popular people who do not look like, outright criminals and so on, that also helps. Having said that, yes, I'm happy to see the progress, but I also see that my own country has quite a way to go.
At this stage, there are a lot of talks again and again about the reforms. Maybe there is a lack of the, let's say, will, or that it's too slow compared to what people expect. But what would be your explanation, and what we should know about, doing the reforms of Ukraine, and what could be the real obstacles, if not to go too general?
I think right now there's a general consensus in the West, if we're talking about how Ukrainian reforms are perceived, is that they are moving in the right direction, that there is a good understanding where Ukraine has to be in terms of European standards, but there's not enough capacity and speed to move forward this change. The blueprint, for example, for decentralization that is part of the new constitution is excellent, but we need faster to approve it in the Parliament and to make it as an operational plan for the country. I also think that there is a bit of a frustration that the rule of law reform is being delayed, that the reform of the prosecutor's office is being delayed, and only now we have the constitutional amendments prepared, and they are with the President to be submitted to the Parliament, and by the time they are approved, so this is all time. I think both Ukrainians and Western community want to have justice restored. So when we have high-profile arrests, like we have right now in Ukraine, it's absolutely clear that they can trust the judiciary to establish the right and the wrong. Until this happens, there will always be doubt in whether these are political prosecutions or these are real criminal and anti-corruption prosecutions.
And you've mentioned the lack of capacity. So can you explain more? Because it's sometimes the question, are the money lacking, or there is something else besides? Okay, if Ukraine gets money, is it enough? But what else?
I think there are two things with financial assistance. On one hand, it's I think Ukraine needs a wider plan how to develop the country and economy in particular. It's not enough just to mention that we will invest in agriculture or in IT industry or in, I don't know, textile or food processing. It has to be clear on the map of Ukraine where are these growth points, which regions have which competitive advantages, where the money should be invested in order to make a difference. I don't think that the Strategy 2020 is this plan. We are used in Ukraine to report our intentions by naming laws, that we need to pass this law, we need to change this regulation. But it's not the story that we are telling, and it is not reflecting on how we will build our economy. I think this is the problem. And then once we have the plan and we have an understanding, some people have to make it happen. People have to develop projects, It's a project-based approach. It's a lot of people have to be good managers to understand how to design a plan that will happen, that money will not be wasted. So we need to retrain a lot of people. And now, when decentralization will happen and communities will get both financial resources and responsibilities to shape, their economic development, do they want to build interlinkages with which regions, with which countries, with which industries, they need to know how to do it.
But if you speak about the current both government and, let's say, new political elite, so still there are the question, is it old or is it new?
I think it's a mixture, I think it's the transition period in a way. I think there's a lot of good people in top senior positions, especially coming from private sector, who know how to manage things, but they are not yet a critical mass of people that will make decisions reality. This is the problem. Ukraine will not change if we will be just making intentions, that we will do this, we will do that. So I think right now we need to change the mid-level of bureaucracy. We need to make this level efficient. I want to see missions for our ministries. For example, what is the mission of Ministry of Economy? What is the mission of Ministry of Youth and Sport? We have to be mission-driven rather than process-driven, because we all the time shuffle different papers. Ministries have huge stack of papers. But what is the purpose? What kind of Ukraine are we really building? Because, of course, we have this association agreement, but I would say it's so technical that it's not like the light in the end of a tunnel. It's a tunnel, but Ukrainians, they need to see this light, and this light could be the story of national development.
And as well, there are a lot of talks about let's support Ukraine. The Ukrainian government speaks about that, the civil society, many people. But at this stage, people don't understand what does it mean, what to support, what we can be concrete. Also with, the recent results of, we have still a lot of troubles.
I think there is a general will to support Ukraine, and also I think now especially European Union and United States, they understand that Ukraine's success is a security issue. That, if Ukraine continues to be mismanaged, corrupt, poor governed state, it's a threat to European peace. That's why this time I think why it's different than in 2004. Of course, because we have aggression, we have Russian annexation, that Europeans really also have, a stake in Ukrainian success. So they are helping. The IMF program is helping to stabilize the economy, but for Ukraine to succeed, we need to have growth and jobs. I think this is the key thing, that and this support should come from private sector through investments to create jobs, and also from governments to keep pressure, to not to lose focus on everything, because there are many things that should happen, but I think they should stick to making sure rule of law is established, because otherwise market economy cannot work properly.
But how you can speak about that about establishing the rule of law in the times when, for instance, one of the politicians like this deputy head of the former deputy head of the Dnipropetrovsk governor Korban, who is a right hand of the famous Ukrainian oligarch and former politician Kolomoisky, is arrested. So again and again there are the talks of the selective justice, which is very old-fashioned way of dealing with the problems in Ukraine by the Ukrainian government and political leaders.
Well, this is exactly what I said at the beginning, that we have to reform the system so that people trust. People trust court decisions. Otherwise, whether some people could be arrested for good reasons, but this will be doubted in the society. And Ukrainians have never seen rule of law. Soviet times, it was not rule of law, it was repressive. 24 years of independence, it was some kind of rule by law, right? Using exactly judiciary for political purposes. That's why I think the amendments that were prepared by the Constitutional Commission, they are good, they are in accordance with the European standards of depoliticized professional courts. So we have to keep pressure and to keep both from society demanding that these constitutional amendments are approved by the parliament. And this is now our biggest challenge, because it hasn't happened yet.
Still, the question about the Ukrainian oligarchs, it was always the issue, and many would say that unless the system is still in place and unless the oligarchs are still the driving force of the Ukrainian economy, Ukrainian politics, it's not really the way forward. So in this regard, in the time of this crisis, what would be the way, I won't say for the government, but really for the different politicians, I won't say for the president himself, whom we can also discuss, is he an oligarch or not, to do? Because somehow everybody of the current oligarchs had done something wrong. It's not just a claim. We have papers, we have all the kind of proofs. In many cases, you can go to the court with all the wrongdoings done within the past years. So do you think in this turbulent time, what is the way, to forget it, to kind of start from the scratch, say okay, we forgive you everything, all the wrongdoings, pretend it hadn't happened, which brings somehow feeling that there is no justice to the society, or really start the real fight, which could be some risk for the state, for the government, and for the society as well. So how to deal with these old guys with their problems who are still there very much in the place?
Well, how oligarchs were making money, I think it was obvious. They were taking deals in a murky privatization where it was not fair. They were benefiting from the state banks and all kinds of state financing. They were making money on procurement. And they were also benefiting from monopolies. So these are the four pillars of oligarchy. So if we want to dismantle the system, and I don't think we should go personality by personality, we should say, okay, now we are trying to make open competitive economy. This is because otherwise Ukraine will never grow. So if we want to create these rules, we need to change them. So this is one way how we should tackle it. But right now, every sector that is not complying by these rules, so for example, monopolization, for example, Akhmetov's energy sector is right now under review of the Anti-Monopoly Committee. Let's see what they say. And the new privatization is coming up. Let's see how they privatize. And I think we have to watch. You know, investigative journalism is very important. I think Ukrainian watchdog organizations should check public procurement because right now data is opening. We are getting more and more tools to fight exactly these evils. And another idea, perhaps, this interesting point of justice that you said. Perhaps the oligarchs could create a fund, each of them contributing to a development of Ukraine, let's say $1 billion fund, all oligarchs committing funding to starting up new businesses on a free and fair, low cost rates for Ukrainians, helping compensating the veterans of the war, helping the families, and, you know, giving a new start and giving back something to the society that will not be just some posh philanthropic projects, but will actually provide added value and give it back to creating some prosperity for Ukrainians.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Громадське відбулося завдяки глядачам, але громадське й надалі потребує вашої допомоги. Громадське належить громадянам і є некомерційним проєктом. Підтримати громадське можна, перерахувавши гроші через PayPal, Приват24 або Money.ua. Ми існуємо, тому що ви нас підтримуєте. Дякуємо.
Дожити до вересня, дотягнути, не розучитися дихати, не збожеволіти, ходити нічними містами, наче заблукані душі, переходити з однієї порожньої вулиці на іншу, це наче розглядати старі фотографії, де поруч тебе померлі друзі, кидати недопалки у воду, раптом змерзнути, підняти голову і зрозуміти, що насправді дивишся вниз, що там так само ходять ті, кого ти колись втратив. Кого ти колись втратив. Ті так само мерзнуть, так само нервово курять.
Це роман про ідеаліста, який вирішує збудувати тунель під кордоном. І таким чином після Євромайдану, після російсько-української війни дати можливість відкрити українцям дорогу у Європу. І документальною основою для цього роману послужила справжня історія, коли в Ужгороді 3 роки тому, у 2012 році, відкрили тунель під кордоном. А Ужгород – це не просто прикордонне місто, а надкордонне, тому що одна з вулиць закінчується шлагбаумом і починається Словаччина. І, власне, на прилеглій до кордону вулиці відкрили тунель довжиною в 700 метрів, в якому була прокладена метро. Так, і це метро перевозило...
Насправді, реальна історія.
Так.
Наголошую.
І це метро перевозило цигарки, наркотики, людські органи, людей і так далі, і так далі. Тобто це був величезний бізнес, в який були замішані і силові структури, бо, наприклад, тунель з українського боку починався із підвалу будинку СБУшника. І в тому числі політики, які кришували цей весь транскордонний проект співробітництва. Тому ця ідея, цей тунель ще 3 роки роки тому мене так вразив, що я почав збирати матеріал і зібрав його достатньо багато, щоб написати роман. Найбільшими корупціонерами і кримінальними мерзотниками у цьому тексті є якраз ті люди, які покликані боротися з усім. Тобто прикордонники і митники, які мали би боротися.
In case of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, there were different stages. So, for instance, the cover stage, like in Crimea, with all these so-called little green men, later using the pretext of the referendum with the local population, with mirroring the mass protests, and later the open military warfare. And what would you say about the current stage? Because we all understand the presence is still there, there is still the conflict, but how would you describe this way, these tactics which is
Well, I think what we have to
happening
realise is there is no standard playbook. I mean, this is one of the things that slightly concerned me about this conference, is people, as people do, they want to come up with what is the sort of the standard pattern, and the whole point is there isn't. They will build their approach based on the situation and the weaknesses they see. So in Crimea, it's because there was a population whom they could mobilise in support of their annexation attempt. In the Donbass, they had to use a lot more force because there wasn't really that kind of mass support. But also the aims. Crimea, it was about annexation. Donbass, it was about creating chaos and putting pressure on Kyiv. So now, I mean, given that the Donbass isn't really working, I mean, what the Russians are doing is trying to, with the least resources possible, keep up the most pressure on Kyiv. So you have this on and off ceasefire. You have this attempt to consolidate Russian control over the local militias and sort of thug armies which they have there and so forth. But no real major campaign, because in a way they're waiting for a political measure. But the point is that I think, and this is what's most worrying, is the next stage we see is an entirely covert stage. I think they realise that the war in the Donbass is lost in one form or another, and instead the war for the future and for the soul of Ukraine has begun. If Ukraine manages to make good on its promises for reform, if Ukraine, after, let's be honest, 20 years of generalised failure, manages to really fix and sort its problems of corruption, of inefficiency, of ungovernability, of oligarchic power, and essentially sort of undemocratic practices. If it manages to solve that, given that Ukraine is, after all, very similar in many ways to Russia, culturally, politically, and so forth, it becomes a very dangerous example. And Russians will say, well, if the Ukrainians can have that, why can't we? So it becomes very much in Russia's interest to ensure the Ukrainians don't get to do that. So I think they're busy rebuilding their networks of influence and intelligence within Ukraine. Great efforts were made to, for example, cleanse the SBU security service of Russian sympathisers and Russian agents. Well, the sense I get is they're now trying to rebuild their connections into the SBU, but just simply these days, just simply suborning and corrupting people. Likewise, politically speaking, it's hard to be sure exactly where the Russians are putting their influence, but I think it is clear that what they want to do is ensure that Ukraine remains politically unstable. So I think this is the preparatory stage. And we're not going to see we're not going to see some sort of new Maidan or anything like that instigated by the Russians. They couldn't, even if they wanted to. Instead, we're going to see little obstacle by little obstacle, little provocation by little provocation, attempts to prevent the reform of Ukraine.
There are different ideas about what's happening, inside the Kremlin, and also how the security system operates. But in case of Donbass, there is a general, not a general, but understanding that there is security service, there is the army, let's say, the military, and there is, the Kremlin, and also there are these guys who are the Orthodox, let's say, like Malafeyev and the others. How united are they? Who is the strongest, or does the whole idea of this kind of separation make sense?
It does. I mean, this is the way Russian politics works. On the one hand, you have Putin, you have a Kremlin whose writ is absolute. You can't go against the Kremlin, at least not overtly. But So long as there aren't instructions coming down, there is all kinds of scope for individual factional and personal and institutional interests to fight it out for authority, for power, and so forth. And so if one looks at the Donbass, there are elements of the military that are clearly enriching themselves. There's a lot of corruption and embezzlement going on. There are the security services, particularly the FSB, Federal Security Service, which has representatives in both Luhansk and Donetsk. And by all accounts, their representatives basically are not friends, and constantly sort of competing for authority. And then you also have the local Donbass, sort of separatist leaders, who on the one hand are tools of the Kremlin, but on the other hand have their own agendas and so forth. So what we have at the moment is this sort of constant swirl of politics and corruption, because there is no clear mandate coming from the Kremlin. The big issue is what happens when that mandate comes. I mean, if, for example, Putin does decide that he can cut some kind of deal and wants to pull out of the Donbass, probably some of the rebel leaders will be given, offered sanctuary and so forth. But a lot of the people in the Donbass won't be happy. What's going to happen then? Are they simply going to say, yes, fair enough, Mr. Putin, that's fine? Or are they going to try and get in the way? Are they going to try and resist? I think that's one reason why we've seen, of late, several rebel commanders turning up dead, is because I think the Kremlin is making sure that the people who will be more problematic don't get the chance to be a problem. So I think that's what we don't know. When it comes down to it, the military, the security services, and so forth, and the kind of the outsider oligarch influences like Malafeyev, they won't challenge the Kremlin. They know what happens if they do. But the locals, there it's much less clear what they'll be doing if Putin does want to pull out.
We speak a lot about Putin himself, but who are the others important people in Russia? What are their names? Who are they?
This is one of the big parlor games of Kremlinologists these days. Come up with your list. It is clear that there have been a shrinking circle of people to whom Putin actually listens and who play an active role in decision making. Exactly who, still a matter of conjecture. If you want, my list, obviously, beyond Putin, there's his presidential chief of staff, Ivanov, who is probably, his closest ally and his kind of closest clone, who probably most follows Putin's thinking. You have Patrushev, who is Secretary of the Security Council, ex-head of the Federal Security Service, very much a hardliner in terms of Russian attitudes. Bortnikov, who's the current head of the FSB. And then we start to guess. Until recently I would have said Yakunin, the head of Russian railways, but then he was sacked. We know there are probably some other people, and some who probably come in just occasionally when it's an issue that relates to them. What's striking, though, is that I can tell you who I don't think is in that circle, and that is a lot of the key ministers who actually have the specialist expertise. Minister of Defense Shoigu, I don't think he's in that circle. Foreign Minister Lavrov, very capable foreign minister, I don't think he's in that circle. Chairwoman of the Central Bank, Nabiullina, who's handled the economy very, very well. These are all people whom Putin and his circle sort of almost, they might listen to them just on technical issues, but basically speaking, their job is just to follow orders and apply whatever orders come from the Kremlin. And what this means is, and this is I think why it really matters trying to identify who is in this little circle around Putin, is how little real knowledge or expertise there really is there.
We're all very interested in what Russia can reach in Syria, how they are, how they assess the situation, and because it's a different playground for the Kremlin, though they were present there for a while. But what would be your assessment?
Well, in terms of how things are going to play out, I think one has to look at it at three levels, because in some ways there are three aims that the Russians have with their deployment into Syria. One was the sort of avowed one, which is to strike at ISIS. That's probably the least important of them all, but at least that's the propaganda one that they're giving. The second one is to support Assad, their ally, one of their very few allies. And the third one, the one that they won't actually acknowledge, is that almost certainly this is primarily really about forcing the West to take Russia into account, forcing the West to stop its attempt at diplomatic isolation, probably with an intention of making some kind of a deal, perhaps in terms of allowing some kind of extraction of Russia from the Donbass and some kind of relaxation of sanctions. So 3 different levels, from geopolitical down to very military. And honestly, against ISIS, 30 bombers are not going to make a big difference, even if they were bombing ISIS, whereas most of the time they're just simply bombing anti-government insurgents of other different varieties. So it's not going to have a great big impact. If anything, it might well be counterproductive. We've now seen this plane go down in Egypt that they're saying was a bomb, which is probably part of a sort of ISIS retaliation. Can they protect Assad? No, not really. Again, unless they're willing to dramatically escalate their presence there, including ground troops. And I really don't see that as being at all likely, or even possible, frankly, for Moscow. Otherwise, all they can really do is just slow the rate at which Assad is defeated. But again, I don't think they care too much about that. Assad is not their real priority. What it really all hinges on is whether or not the West is willing to cut some kind of a deal. Basically, in return for Russia being more cooperative, more collaborative in the Middle East, helping perhaps constrain Iran, helping perhaps negotiate some departure of Assad and the creation of a new regime in Damascus, but whatever. If Russia is willing to cooperate in the Middle East, then Russia will expect a price elsewhere, quite possibly in terms of sanctions or whatever. So that's really it. And now Russia really just depends on how the West is going to respond.
And how the West is going to respond. Probably you don't know yourself, but what could be the idea, the analysis?
Well, already, I mean, even after the first couple of days in which particularly the United States was just saying how terrible this was and how foolhardy it was, we've seen actually the rhetoric shift. Now Assad doesn't have to go immediately, it can just be part of a process. Already the Russians, like it or not, are part of that equation. Europe is much more keen to make a deal over Ukraine than Washington. I mean, that is pretty much clear. From the Europeans' point of view, peace is the key thing. Until you have peace in Ukraine, then in a way you can't get anything else. Washington, I think, is more unwilling to be seen to make some kind of a deal. So really it just depends out of these two sort of philosophies which applies. The question is, in a way, how hard a bargain Putin wants to drive. I suspect that he wants out of the Donbass. I suspect he realizes that this was a stupid mistake, that he's now stuck. It's politically expensive, it's militarily expensive, it's financially expensive. And so he's just desperate for some kind of a face-saving deal which will allow him to sort of pull out. And if he's willing to give ground, then to be honest, I think the Europeans will push for some kind of a deal. But again, in that respect, it depends on Putin. And one thing I do know is you can never really predict what Putin's going to do.
Before we go into Ukraine and Donbass, we know how Russian Secret Service can really work well with corrupting, with dividing, with being embedded to the, any other group in society. But that's something which doesn't work that well with probably these people like the ISIS fighters. Mm-hmm. So in that way, it's interesting. How are they going to deal with that, and what could be really, what can Russians do in Syria, practically on the ground? I'm speaking about the Russian military.
On the ground, exactly. They don't really have the same scope for covert penetration. There are a few options. I mean, we've already seen, for example, that there's a rise in methamphetamine drug production and use within Syria, because both government and rebel forces use methamphetamines to stay alert, and there's also a lot of export. And there are some criminal groups that actually cross the border lines between the government and non-government forces. So there might be some scope for the Russians to use these organized crime things. But on the whole, this is a war that is going to be fought militarily. And so what the Russians are providing is not just the planes that are doing the bombing raids, but a lot of intelligence support. We have radio-technical intelligence trying to eavesdrop onto rebel communications. There is probably also the sort of support of some small teams of special forces going in to try and identify targets that the planes will then hit. But when it comes down to it, the Syrian regime was trained by the Soviets and then by the Russians. It uses Russian methodologies. There's not much that the Russians can really teach the Syrians about, to put it bluntly, torture and counterinsurgency. So really all the Russians can do is just provide a bit of material, a bit of firepower, and hope that that actually helps, if not change the nature of the war, but at least give Assad a little bit more time.
Because what we discuss a lot for the Russians, it's very hard to fight somebody who is doing an ideological fight, really, who is determined, as probably the ISIS is.
Yes, this is it. I mean, ISIS is determined, ISIS is efficient, unfortunately. They've been fighting enough years that a lot of their soldiers are actually quite effective veterans, even though others are just brand new sort of recruits. But also, generally speaking, this has been a Soviet as well as a Russian problem. They are great at fighting massed armies. They are great at fighting organized societies that they can penetrate and subvert and put off balance and destabilize. But when you're fighting guerrillas, and it doesn't matter if they're Afghans, Chechens, or Syrians, or Iraqis, who don't have those kind of structures, they don't follow the rules, they operate in small, semi-autonomous groups. In some ways, this is exactly the kind of enemy that the Russians don't like fighting. It's why in Chechnya, they basically outsourced the war to their own local Chechens and Ramzan Kadyrov's murderous followers. So this is not the kind of war that the Russians are really well suited to fight.
And what could be also the role of the Russian fighters within ISIS? Because we know also that it's not that largely covered in the news, but there are some.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons why I think the Russians were willing to go into Syria. They're aware of, the numbers are really all guesstimates. Maybe 2,500 Russian citizens are meant to be with ISIS. Some of them are going to stay, some of them are going to die, but some of them are already beginning to come back. By the Russians' own account, they say they've arrested about 100 of the returnees. But the Russians really have very little idea of how many there are. Many of these come from the North Caucasus. And for the Russians, I think the real big nightmare is precisely you'll get people who've gone, they fought with ISIS for a year, for 6 months, for 18 months. They've come back not just with expertise, not just with weapons, but with friends and with an ideology. And if you look at what's happening in the North Caucasus at the moment, you have lots and lots of small local groups, fighting cells, they call them Jamaats, which are fighting, as it were, their own little insurgency war against Russia, pinprick by pinprick. This is painful and awkward for the Russians, but they can survive this for as long as they need to. The big nightmare is that when you start having people with ISIS loyalties coming into the North Caucasus, they will actually begin to unite these different groups and turn what at the moment is a sort of a localized terrorist campaign into a regional insurgency, which actually will see the North Caucasus as a whole begin to sort of burst into flames. So in that respect, actually, the prospect of Russian fighters coming back is a real challenge. And the other way it's a real challenge is some of these fighters are Central Asians. We know that there are some who are being recruited from in the Urals region as well as Moscow. And these are the people who, after all, who dig the metro tunnels, who service the oil pipelines, who do a lot of the work that Russians don't like doing. First of all, they might well be in a position to commit acts of terrorism and sabotage. But secondly, there is the risk of a national backlash amongst ethnic Russians. They're going to start seeing all Central Asians as jihadist wannabes. And frankly, the Russian economy can't cope without these poorly paid, hard-working Central Asians doing a lot of the miserable work that Russians don't want to do. So this is actually a challenge which stretches from the possibility of North Caucasus insurgency through the possibility of localized terrorism, all the way through to actually wider social and economic problems.
This conference is very important for the whole region, and the biggest topic is obviously security in Europe post the Russian-Ukrainian war and how to deal with it, because people are feeling very insecure. After Russia invaded Crimea in eastern Ukraine, the whole system is challenged, and nobody quite sure what to do next. Either we throw away the whole system of international law and security system that was built after World War II and try to find something new solution. Either we're trying to find fixes for already half-broken system. Do you think that those fixes are even available, or we should be creative and find something new?
Well, I don't think that the actual system, the international system, is necessarily broken. It's obviously went through a shockwave, not only the Ukrainian crisis and the Russian aggression, but I think for a lot of people, particularly in the European Union and in Europe, now the combination of the Ukrainian crisis as well as the migration crisis, which is so both east and the south. And obviously Russia could be connected in both, although, I do think that Russia's role in Syria is much more exaggerated, which obviously is helping to keep Putin's image in the West and the international community as somebody much more powerful than actually he would be, or Russia is. But because it's not, I don't think it's necessarily broken. Obviously it's shaken. Obviously the Ukrainian crisis was showing the limits of Western dominance, let's put it like that, as well as because of this international system, let's be honest about that, essentially it's a Western, mostly American dominant, and as the American influence or dominance is fragmenting, or it's essentially moving, weakening or shattering, the local conflicts and the local issues are getting into the limelight.
But if other country invades, its neighbor and annexes part of the territory, I cannot see where the parallel between Western influence or not. It's just really, really basic stuff we're based our international system on.
Right. The issue is that this is not the Russians who were doing the first time, and this is not what the Russians invented. The same with the hybrid wars and all this. This is not what simply Russia invented. We would like to believe and we'd like to see or wish accordingly, but it's not the case. Obviously, I don't want to draw parallels between Western action in Kosovo or in Yugoslavia, because it was a really different, the two issues. At the same time, what the West have been doing and Russia have been doing, again, they're different. But
they challenged the system before.
We challenged the system. The West challenged the system before. Just think about Iraq. Just think about Afghanistan. And it obviously has exactly. So Russia's role, obviously from the viewpoint of Ukraine, this is something totally different. But if you put that Ukraine question into a global perspective, you have certain history, and this history is not that far away. It's just only 10 years back, so we should remember, right? So this is obviously a resonance of that, and again, I do believe and do see this, that as a Western dominance is changing, and the local factors and the local influence is getting, or the regional factors and the regional influence is getting stronger by default.
But one thing is to adapt the whole system towards changing powers and changing balance between powers. The other one is to go straight to tribalism, where there are no laws and everybody acts according to their interests. How do you try avoid this?
Exactly, and but I would like to raise the attention that even the Russians, when they annexed Crimea, a certain, at least the image of the law, right? There was a referendum, so-called referendum. Obviously, I don't want to argue that there was a real referendum, but the point is that at least the image of a referendum was done, right? So even the Russians were keen.
So do you think that they care?
Well, they did, at least preserving the image, right? So I don't think that this is an outright, and particularly not a planned Russian aggression against the international system, but obviously for good reason. Both Ukraine and West is seeing it such a way, and again, it's justified why they're seeing it such a way. At the same time, just think about it, if you're putting it in the context of the past 20 years, Ukraine is still, although it has a lot of global and even particularly European repercussion, it's a local conflict. And it's a local conflict in Ukraine or between Ukraine and Russia, right? With a global repercussion. But it's really the Ukrainian crisis is now resonating with the combination of the migrant crisis. And this is where the Europeans started to think, what exactly, and this conference is essentially is covering what is our systems and mechanisms, whether these are in place, whether these are good enough, what we can do to strengthen those, whether these fixes, as you call it, I would call it corrections, both policy and instrumental corrections, which we need to do. I'm going to give you a very quick example, like, are we paying the dues, NATO members? Not really, right? So, these are the corrections I'm talking about. Like, unfortunately, the institutions did not work. And we see that, for example, the NATO reaction on the Ukrainian crisis was very weak because major like basic things, basic reactions and steps, which the NATO should do immediately. It was not in place.
Damon, the Atlantic Council is doing a lot on analyzing what's happening in the foreign relations between the US and Europe regarding the Russian aggression in Ukraine as well. But there are those who are saying that more or less the United States, the White House, has given Ukraine, it outsourced Ukraine to Germany, like to Europe in this case. What would be your answer on that?
So I think there's some truth to the fact the United States is working quite closely with the Chancellor in particular, and Germany in particular, in the Ukraine crisis. And there very much is an instinct in this administration to support and to back Chancellor Merkel, to back German leadership on this issue. And while part of that is right, and part of that makes much sense, and I've been very pleased to see how Germany and the Chancellor herself has been firm on the sanctions issues, it's insufficient for the scale of the task that we face right now. At the end of the day, we really are in a crisis with Russia, a confrontation with Russia. This is the greatest challenge to global security. What Russia has done in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, its invasion in the east, these are fundamental principles that shake the foundations of the global world order that we helped build and sustain. And so ultimately, to get this right, the Americans have to be at the forefront. We have to be there really helping to manage, I think, this crisis in a direct way, not just playing a supporting role for the EU, or not just playing even a side-by-side role for the EU. We're going to have to actually lead on this effort and lead in the resolution of the effort.
But the United States are not during the negotiation. We're speaking about the Normandy Forum. So really still, how big is the involvement compared to the one which could happen in a different circumstances?
Right. So we saw in the Georgia...
Usually the U.S. would be more involved.
Right. We saw in the Georgia conflict, and we see in the Ukraine conflict, the United States trying to help stand behind and back European Union leadership on these issues. In Georgia, it was President Sarkozy in France, and Ukraine, it's Germany and Chancellor Merkel. That doesn't work. We're dealing in a crisis and a confrontation with Russia. Russia's too strong, too powerful, and too much of a bully for the European Union by itself, for Germany by itself, to be able to manage that conflict, to manage that crisis. After all, Mr. Putin comes to the table knowing that he's got nuclear weapons, he's got a military modernization program, he's got a reputation of being willing to use force. And he knows that at all costs the Europeans want to do, their biggest necessity is to avoid a war, avoid confrontation, avoid fighting. Well, we all want that, but then to get a negotiation right, whether it's Minsk or even over Georgia, Mr. Putin needs to know that he's sitting across the table, or that the Russians are having to negotiate with a strength of power. He understands power politics. So I think the United States has to be much more engaged in the future of Ukraine.
But how it can go together with trying to sort it out and make some kind of a deal and cooperation in Syria, if we can speak about that, while being in confrontation regarding Ukraine.
This is the trap that Mr. Putin has set for the West.
And what is the way out of this trap?
You know, I think he's run into some difficulties in Ukraine. He's also suffering under the sanctions regime. So we've seen a little bit of a quieting down in Ukraine. He's not fulfilling Minsk, but he's quieting down a little bit. But he's doubling down in Syria. And I worry what we're going to see is a Russian effort to, one, undermine the solidarity to continue the sanctions regime, because after all, there's not as much fighting in Ukraine. It's calmer, even if Minsk hasn't been satisfied. And after all, he's playing a quote-unquote constructive role in helping to come to a peace talks in Syria over the future of Assad. I think these are traps. I don't think we have a way forward yet in Syria and in Ukraine. I think we actually to have an agreement with Putin on any of these issues, he's going to have to actually feel the costs in a more acute way to his actions.
But how it comes? After the annexation of Crimea, the West already should have been on the high alert from Russia, and then you say there is a trap again. So how it's possible to be, to get into these traps?
Right. So this is the Putin model that we've seen: conflict with the West, a broken relationship, some costs against Russia, the West feeling uncomfortable that we don't have a good relationship with Russia, and actually beginning to negotiate with ourselves on how to get things back to normal. And so that's my fear here, is that we may see Mr. Putin try to leverage Syria for a way to get out of the box that he's put himself in on Ukraine by making himself an indispensable actor in the future of the Middle East, and therefore restoring his sense of credibility, normalcy, legitimacy in the world order. And 2 years after Crimea, the worst pain that he's felt, that we walk that back. And that would be a strategic mistake.
You're already thinking about the post-election, meaning the election in the US, policy towards Europe, towards the region, towards Eastern Europe. So why, I mean, it's always necessary to think in advance, but do you think within the next year there won't be any major shift and it's more or less the put on freeze?
So look, my view of this is we need to maximize what's possible in the current political environment through our budget cycle, through the support for Ukraine. There's some real limits to what this administration will do. They've been supportive of Ukraine in many ways. We've seen that recently in the debt restructuring issues like that. But there are also some limits to what they will do, and they've been very public about that. Some of the security assistance and other issues in support of Ukraine. So we don't give up. This is a very dangerous period. This is a period where Putin thinks that he can get away with certain behavior. My biggest concern is that we not throw Mr. Putin a lifeline in this next year, that we not extend to him a lifeline that allows him to get out from under the pressure of the sanctions regime, and that we not actually embolden and empower him because of how he manipulates the situation in Syria to his effect.
So what we could expect after 2000, with the new American president, and how it could differ depending on who is in the White House? So look, this
is a pretty strategic, historic time. The reality is we don't have a very clear strategy or a very clear view among Democrats, Republicans, among the political elite. There isn't a sense in Washington about, this is how we need to manage our relationship with a revanchist Russia and with Europe. We're thinking through that. We're working through that. You're going to see the churn intellectually, policy-wise. There's going to be more American forces in Europe, no doubt. You'll see a Warsaw summit that delivers a stronger presence here, and we're sitting here in Riga, Latvia. I predict you'll see a permanent presence of American forces here. This is just the beginning of us getting this right. We're slow, but we do know something fundamental has happened, and we can't just go back to a normal relationship with Mr. Putin.
Is there any time span? Because when you speak, for instance, and to listen to the general commander of the U.S. forces in Europe, he would say that there are, like the colonels running the American military in the Baltic states. It's still not that many people, compared to all the odds which are taking place.
Right. I think you'll see an incremental move on this over the coming year, but I think you'll actually see a bigger move over this over time. We're going to come to the realization that actually this is a pretty profound crisis that actually only American leadership in tandem with Europe is going to help us navigate. And it's going to take a clear strategy of standing up to Putin. We don't want to move headlong into war with Russia. We actually want to avoid a war with Russia by being strong and making it very clear to Vladimir Putin that if he violates any of these tenets, he's going to pay a very damaging price. So that means stronger costs to Russia, stronger support for Ukraine, and a better strategy to bolster our alliance, including the permanent presence of American forces here.
In what situation the American support to Ukraine can withdraw?
Right. So I think there is a risk that if we don't do enough to support Ukraine, right now, in my view, I think the international community is helping Ukraine stay just above water. You're not drowning, you're staying just above water. But we don't need Ukraine to just survive. We actually need Ukraine to thrive. Our best strategy to defeat Mr. Putin's tactics here is a successful Ukraine. And so I think we need to be much more in and invested in your success in a more profound way. That means we actually need to see more profound commitment to anti-corruption efforts, to reform efforts in Ukraine. But we need a mutually reinforcing, virtuous cycle of moving up, stronger Western support, stronger Ukrainian action. What could happen is that Western leaders could be, some Western leaders who are already ambivalent about Ukraine already suspect and are concerned, why should we invest so much money in Ukraine when this is a corrupt society? We know what will happen. If they start to see a slowdown of reforms, if they start to think that the corruption is actually not changing, this will sap the support in the West.
This was Hromadske International Sunday show, our special partnership with the Riga Conference, which is one of the major foreign security and relations event in the region. Follow us, and there would be a lot more from the other Eastern European capitals, and not even just Eastern European.
Because that's what Hromadske International is about, explaining not only Ukraine but Eastern and Central Europe. So follow us, obviously, on all our social media platforms. We have a lot of them this time. And go to our website and check out the Grand Central for our Riga conference. Follow us if you want to find out more what we've been doing in Riga, using hashtag on Twitter, Hromadske Riga. And we have a lot of additional digital content for you to explore. Just go on our website. But at this time, it's all for this Sunday. Join us next Sunday for more, and we're really happy to be here and to report this event for you.